Cool. All right. Hi, guys. I have pretty crappy internet. I'm from the developing world. So if at any point, like I phase out, please let me know that, I'm stuttering or you can't hear me. And that's important because this is being recorded and it'll be posted on YouTube. So I need you all to confirm that you can actually hear me because I presume the recording gets fuzzy as well. Just to start off with, this lecture is just going to be a bunch of thoughts, okay? I'm not a massive believer in like specific directed content, because at least like when I used to debate back, actually I didn't debate that long ago. I've been debating very recently as well, pretending to be old. But what I struggled with when I went to different circuits or when I went to the World Championship was I saw debaters conceptualizing particular things that were taught to me very differently from where I am, where I learned debating. And it's not just the World Championship. For like little things like in my first ABP, which is the biggest Asian BP tournament in the region, I learned in the bubble room of ABP that this house believes that motion is different from an actor motion. Like these are things that you teach kids nowadays, especially with the online world. Everything is accessible, but those are the little things that I had to learn through trial and error at actual tournaments where, not knowing those things cost me a lot of points. And what I always felt was the most I've learned from debating is through the fortunes I've had of meeting these really great debaters who were really successful at what they did, and them telling me how they thought about particular things, the way they think about particular issues of debating or their philosophies on debating, and how they approach particular parts of it. Which is why I'm not going to try to bore you today with things you'll find in the million PM speech lectures you can see on YouTube, because I think like there are a bunch of really good PM speech lectures, I'm sure, on YouTube by debaters that are far greater than I am and have accomplished far more. What I will try to do is, at least on the topic that I've been assigned, which is PM speeches, try to reconceptualize it or give you certain thoughts about it that I've discovered over the last 3 to 4 years that I've done university debating. And hopefully those thoughts will have some bearing in the way in which you conceptualize the role of a prime minister in debating. Yeah. So just to make things clear, everything here is an opinion. Try not to take anything within this lecture as hard fact. I'm not going to pretend like I'm the most knowledgeable or the most successful person or even near one of the best PMs. These are just a bunch of thoughts that I have. You can, of course, disagree with me. You can ask me questions about why these thoughts came into being. And we can have a discussion about that as well. Of course, other people have different philosophies, and those philosophies are equally useful in winning debates. I've lost my fair share of debates in my life. But I just hope these thoughts are going to be useful for you guys to take something away and think about PM speeches slightly differently. Yeah. So I just want to set expectations clear. The first is this lecture assumes you've done a bit of debating in the past, which means it's not for someone that has never heard of what a PM speech is. I'm not going to be here like telling you what a PM speech is for the first time. Probably the wrong lecture for you if this is the case. The second is it's not going to be a bunch of rigid suggestions where I tell you this is what you have to do. It's more like think about these things and then decide what you want to do, right? So the slight difference in approach to this lecture will be evident. The third is I will not cover how to structure arguments within your speech, right? Like, of course, a large part of the PM speech is arguments and analyzing arguments, but those can have independent lectures themselves and are not specific to PM necessarily. So I'll try to avoid that as much as possible when I'm explaining the kinds of things that I want you guys to take away. Any questions so far? Just as a side note, please feel free to continuously dump questions throughout this lecture within the chat. I'll try to take a few questions intermittently, especially if it's relevant to the discussion that's ongoing. And then, of course, at the end of the class, we can have a brief discussion on the kinds of questions that you have. But try to just put a bunch of questions that you may have popping into your head as soon as they pop into your head, of course, and dump it into the chat. I'll respond whenever is apt, if that's okay. Yeah, cool. You guys can still hear me, right? I'm really afraid that my internet dies whenever. So continuous affirmation would be really useful. Please let me know if you can hear me.
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay, awesome. Cool. So I've divided this lecture into 3 parts. The first is a reminder of the usual. So I think the way we think about PM speeches, there are some traditional usual things that we think about, which are not necessarily wrong, but I just want to remind you of those things before we delve into the other stuff, and just give you some slight suggestions of them before going into the more advanced stuff, which is covered in the second and third part. The first thing to note is, what is the traditional conception of a PM speech that or at least I believe a vast majority of circuits tend to follow when they're teaching like a kid what a PM speech is supposed to do for the first time, right? So the role of the first speaker is to lay the groundwork for a debate. I've heard this a million times, right? Make the debate clear, set the necessary beginning characterization for the debate to have like fair precedence, right? Like make sure that you don't make the debate confusing for all teams. Do a really good job of making it clear and giving necessary build up for the rest of the debate, and possibly make some positive contributions and arguments, right? So these are the kinds of things that we tend to think of when we are hit with the idea of the PM speech. These are not necessarily wrong, but I think there are things that you can add to this, which I will talk about in the second part of this lecture. But when we want to do even these things well, there are a couple of things that we should keep in mind. I hope you guys do know these things. I'll just give like some brief suggestions as we go through them. The first is, in terms of setting up a debate, it is useful to have a powerful context or characterization to begin your speech with, right? If you look at the great PM speeches, they'll always start with this emotional thing where they talk about a really important problem that deserves solution, right? And the thing I want to note is, I feel like there are 2 kinds of problems that debaters suffer from when dealing with this. The first is they often like don't do it, which is more of an elementary thing where they just feel like being mechanical is fine, saying things like, we'll have 3 arguments, and being super mechanical and objective, and not necessarily making the debate emo or making the debate rhetorical. I think it is useful to use the first 20 to 30 seconds to actually get the judge's attention and use a powerful emotional context, or use powerful words, sometimes write it down on a piece of paper, and actually start your speech with that. Because it does grab a judge's attention for the rest of your speech. If you start off in a really boring tone, they tend to not follow. So that's one problem. The other problem that I've seen teams suffer from is they tend to overdo it, right? To the point where it's unstrategic. So let's say the motion is about something about, helping refugees, right? And in most debates, you'll see that both sides of the debate agree that refugees deserve help. Like no one's going to go up and say, refugees deserve to die, like screw them, send them to hell, something like that, right? So if you spend the first 30 seconds of your PM speech rhetoricizing how bad the situation is for refugees, it's just unstrategic, right? Like, because the opponents are just going to come up and say, yeah, we agree. Here's a better way to solve it, right? And just suggest something else that happens in the status quo or happens alternatively. So what I want you to remember is, even though you are using a powerful emotional context, do use it strategically, in the sense that, refer to alternative solutions within that have failed. So you'll see, whenever it's, say, the classic 2011, speech about from Viktor Frankl about invading Zimbabwe, right? The emotional rhetoric he starts using in his speech, which is the WUDC 2011 Open Final, refers to alternatives that have been tried and failed, right? And those are things that he subtly puts into the context and builds up characterization through it as well. So don't make it rhetoric for the sake of rhetoric. Do add elements of strategy, because otherwise it's just, useless. Like the other team is just going to be like, yeah, we agree. Here's a better way to solve the problem. So that's the first really basic thing. The second is, I think it's important to clearly clarify what world you want to reach at the end of your speech, right? And this is, again, told to really young debaters all the time. Like, make sure your PM speech clarifies what your objectives are and what the world is that you want to create. But again, I feel like this is another mistake that debaters make, because they tend to think that it's not as necessary for BP as it is for other formats that they've learned earlier on. They think it's a very world schools thing to do. While it is true, it is a very world schools thing to do, it is useful, to also do it in BP as well, because it adds clarity to a debate and makes it very evident what exactly your arguments tie back to, in absence of which a lot of times your arguments do become confusing. The third is, I feel like PMs often forget that they're supposed to tell a judge what metrics the debate should be judged by. I know there's a massive debate about this in debate serious posting right now, like how much should you actually tell a judge? I'm a massive believer in like trying to win debates in as many ways as possible, and I've had my fair share of bad judging in my life. So I think it's perfectly fine, like again, my personal opinion, to tell a judge that these are the ways in which this debate should be judged, and these are the metrics in which you should clarify exactly what you want to achieve. And this is important because like you need to outframe a lot of things that are going to come from your opposition. They're going to say things like, you know, something else matters. So it's very clear to, it's very important to make it clear to the judge from a very early stage what these metrics are that you're basing your case on. The last thing that I think is important is you do need to recognize that models are a really important part of debating, right? To the point where I feel like teams nowadays just don't recognize that, especially on Gov, that a model is probably your biggest superpower, right? They're so focused on making arguments that they tend to forget that you can like remove 4 or 5 arguments from a debate just by having a good model from Prime Minister. So I want you guys to see the WUPID 2010 quarters. There was a PM speech by Tim Mooney, I think is probably one of the best PMs in the world ever. This was a debate where the motion was something like, this house would grant immunity to dictators that voluntarily step down. Yeah. So the motion is this. And of course, like you can say a bunch of reasons why it's useful. He starts with a powerful characterization about how, you know, Pol Pot grabbed onto power for an extra 20 years despite being deposed, etc., etc. All the things we discussed previously. Then he gave a 5-layered model that removed, I think, 5 arguments from opposition. The first was, and they were all conditions under which this immunity would be given. Number 1, this dictator would have to give information in return for immunity. Who was involved during his regime? What were the activities they did, right? So this creates a lot of benefits that opposition would just say, you know, you need to punish this person because there's a lot of benefit through that punishment. They, you know, this balances that out with a countervailing benefit. The second is, the second layer of the model was, it was about public accountability, where it was made, guys, can you mute yourself, please? Yeah, okay, I just muted. So the second layer of the model was about public accountability, where the model was basically that this person, whoever is getting the immunity, would be required to apologize publicly in recognition of the fact that they're getting immunity and they have committed the crimes regardless. And then this mitigates a lot of the, you know, closure stuff for victims that you know is coming from opposition. The third is, I think, if I remember correctly, wait, I have it written down somewhere. Just give me a sec. Right. The third layer of the model was this person would have to allow peacekeepers to enter his country in order to ensure post-conflict stability. So, you know, after he steps down, it's not just going to be a random, you know, like conflict where, you know, terrible things evolve, as you've seen in a vast majority of Middle Eastern countries whenever a dictator is deposed. The fourth thing is, the fourth layer of the model was this person can never comment about politics in his country in the future. This removes opposition arguments about, you know, this person, if you're giving him immunity, will still play a very important role within politics and shape, you know, political culture into the future, which can lead to democratic backsliding into his regime, etc., etc. The fifth layer of the model was this person would be exiled and this person would have no role to play within the country that he presides in. So yeah, there's literally no geographic possibility of this person, you know, reinvigorating his movement. So it was a model that I think Tim Mooney spent about a good 1.5 to 2 minutes on. But do you realize why these 5 layers are things that were thought out very well in prep and removed a bunch of opposition arguments that would otherwise significantly dent his case? So I know that all PMs know they have the power to make a model. I just don't think they consciously spend enough time on it. Like for some reason, once you get to like 2 or 3 layers, sometimes not even them, you tend to think that that's enough. But there are some really great speeches that have spent like, a considerable amount of time making a model and winning the debate through that model, right? So I think the thing to remember is don't be rigid with these things, right? And here's the advice for the things you already know. Like, I don't think anything I've said now is new rocket science. Like, all of this is stuff you've heard about PM speeches already, right? What I want you to know is you shouldn't be rigid about these things, right? Maybe in WSDC, that's a different case. But at least in BP, no one really cares about structure per se, right? While structure is useful in achieving clarity, things like, you don't have to literally list things like, okay, the characterization for this case is this, the objective is this, the model is this, right? Sometimes objectives are interwoven within the powerful context. Like, you can just say that enough, illustrating a problem and just say enough is enough. We don't want this to happen. And that's why we want this model to be passed. What are we going to do? And then transition to the model, right? Instead of explicitly saying what the objective is. So try not to be rigid about these things, but do recognize or do be cognizant of the fact that these things are useful and these things do add to the clarity of your PM speech in general. Anyway, so that's the stuff I presume everyone already knows. Before we go on to the fun stuff, any questions? Any questions?
I had a question.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, like, how do you impact your characterization in the debate?
As in, like, how do you characterize a case? Is that the question?
Yeah, like, you have characterized, but how do you like sell your characterization? Like, why should we even care about your characterization in the first place? Like, what role does this characterization plays in the status quo? Like, how do you sell it?
Okay. Firstly, this can get an independent lecture about, like, characterizing debates and analyzing how a particular problem exists. So I won't go into that in too much detail. But in terms of things like the really basic things I think about whenever I'm trying to characterize a problem that I think deserves a solution and my side solves it, I think of a few things. The first is, what exactly is the problem that is being solved by the motion, right? Like, who does it affect? How much? Like, to what extent does the problem exist? The second thing is, and this is a very important flip to the first thing. It's why has the problem not been solved yet, right? And this requires you to analyze alternatives that have been tried, and these alternatives are things that the opposition will push for. So analyzing why those alternatives have not worked in the past, and then explaining what is the missing link or the missing gap in the alternatives, and then transitioning that into why your model fills that gap and arguments subsequently, right? So as a brief suggestion, it would be, think about the problem in great detail and the extent to which it exists, but don't just think of the problem in vacuum. Think about why it hasn't been solved yet. And of course, based on that, you can make suggestions and then transition that into your case. Yeah, I hope that's clear enough. I don't want to go into too much detail because then that'll just be a lecture about analysis, which we probably don't have the time for. Any other brief questions before we move forward?
Yeah, just a quick question.
Yeah.
I don't know if it 100% makes sense, but on your idea, for example, the model that was given with the dictator or PM speech, how much of that can you fiat as a PM member, and how much of that do you need to prove, and where's the line between?
Okay, the first thing is, none of it is fiat. You can just explain why, despite these conditions, dictator will still pick immunity if given the choice. And there are lots of reasons you can suggest for that, right? You don't have to say these things in fiat. You can just prove them, right? And if you look at the Tim Mooney speech, he does actually prove them. Like, one of the arguments explicitly was why dictators will still accept this. That's the first thing to note. The second thing to note about fiat is just try not to be unreasonable, right? Don't pretend like your model has to apply in all cases. In the sense that you can just say that whatever it is, as long as it's better than the status quo, it's fine, right? Like, so for example, there was a debate that I did very recently. It was a fun debate. We were second, actually, from OG. The motion was something like, this house would break up companies that are a threat to democracy, or something like that. It was the IBA Nations League. I don't remember. And we had a model that was basically a bunch of regulatory checks of how this process would happen. And of course, right, like opposition is going to argue, like if all of these things are to pass, will it ever be executed, right? And our defense was, and like my teammate was Mubarak, he was going second, and a very valid response that he made was, it doesn't matter if it doesn't happen a lot of times. Even if it happens a few times, those are few times that don't exist in the status quo. It is opposition's burden to defend the status quo where those few times this model is not exercised, right? So of course, don't be unreasonable, but just think about the status quo. As long as it's better, you're fine. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, okay. Boring stuff over. Let's move on to the fun stuff. Yeah, so now I'm just going to share a bunch of radical thoughts that I've had. And these thoughts have come based on like random exposure that I've had to really good debaters, fortunately, based on the last 3 to 4 years of debating, because I'm not a PM by wish. I personally just don't like going PM. Like as soon as my long-term team made sure they moved to Australia, I went back to second and third. I'm not a personal fan of the role. But when I was debating with him, I tried to understand the role better by looking at some of the best PMs across the world. And of course, different people have different suggestions of what they believe a proper PM speech is. But the more I've thought about it, and the more I tried to simplify it for myself, the more I realized that a good PM speech is really just a whip speech, okay? And the things you tend to think about what a whip does is really what they expect you to do in a PM if you want it to be a really good PM speech. I'm not joking, right? So what does this mean? The best PM speeches engage and win debates independently, right? So if you think about what you traditionally think of a whip speech, right? The general thoughts that come to your head, the last speaker in a debate is supposed to bring in the points of contention, supposed to engage those points of contention, point out the failed burdens of the opposition and the successful attempts at achieving those burdens from your own side, making sure you point out exactly what analysis is going to win you the debate versus the analysis that the opposition is going to fail at making or has failed at making, right? Those are the things you tend to associate with a whip speech for some reason. Like there's no necessary truth to why this is only for a whip. It's just that these things have been reinforced in our heads about a whip speech so many times that we tend to think that whip speeches are primarily supposed to do this, while the other speeches, we naturally think, a PM and a DPM, what do? They just make arguments. The second speaker does a bunch of rebuttal and makes more arguments, whereas the whip is the speech where all of this stuff happens. Not true, right? Okay, I got a message that my internet connection is unstable. Can you guys still hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, fantastic. So these thoughts about like traditionally what a whip speech does is not necessarily something that should be restricted to whips, right? So I just want to help you guys navigate through the kinds of things that a whip does that you should transition into a PM speech as well, okay? So the first thing is identifying major areas of contention or clash in a debate, right? So there's this, okay, I'm going to use a bunch of debate examples. I'll give you reference links at the end of the lecture so you can watch these videos. They're all on YouTube. I'm from Bangladesh. I don't watch these debates live. They're all on YouTube for me as well. But there was a debate that I watched growing up, and I never consciously thought of what the PM was doing until much later, where I tried to gather these thoughts together. And I'm sure it's a debate that a vast majority of you have seen as well. It's WUDC 2010 Open Quarters, where there was a fantastic, I think, Auckland team on OG and a fantastic Oxford team on OO. So the Oxford team is like, people we idolized from a young age, the Sheng Wus and JLMs. But the Gov team, the OG team, was also pretty fantastic in that debate as well. So the motion was this house would ban all race-altering procedures, right? And you'll notice that the first argument that was made by PM was essentially a clash or a contention in the debate, which is, can states restrict choices, right? And this is not necessarily phrased as a positive argument. It's phrased as a contention in general. Like, imagine this debate happening, and at the end of the debate, like when whip speeches come, and they say there are 3 points of contention in the debate, presumably this question would have been one of the points of contention, which is, can states restrict choices? But what really good debaters do is they tend to, like, fast forward that to the first speech outright, right? They phrase arguments as questions, and those questions inevitably become questions that will be argued in the rest of the debate, and they're phrased early on in that way, right? And this gives the PM speech far more of a whippy effect that implicitly has rebuttal within it, right? So if you phrase it as a question, which is, can states restrict choices, you will inevitably talk about situations where they can and why this applies there, and situations where they can't and why that is not, like, why that does not relate to the situation in concern for this motion, right? So that naturally engages some arguments that for a fact are coming from opposition anyway, right? So the first thing to do is, in prep, identify what points of contention are going to be relevant in the debate, phrase your arguments using those questions, and add analysis that implicitly engages and wins those contentions anyway, right? Oh, yeah, okay. So I just explained step 2 and step 1 together. Yeah, so phrase major questions and strategic questions to answer each clash, right? So if states can restrict choices, a sub-question that you can ask under this is, why choices are not absolute, and this is a circumstance in which states can restrict choices, right? So that's a sub-question that I just referred to when explaining step 1 as well. The third thing to do is, I think it's important to phrase the entire argument preemptively, right? And I think PMs tend to make the mistake of thinking about preemptives all wrong, okay? And I've seen so many PMs, even me at a younger age, where the PM structure is like, okay, I have 3 positive arguments, argument 1, argument 2, argument 3. And then this really silly part of their speech where they go, by the way, opposition might say these things. If they say these things, here are my responses as preemptive. But I've noticed that, number one, in a vast majority of cases, opposition teams make arguments that are different to the, classic arguments that PM tends to think they're going to make. So it's a massive hit or miss in a lot of cases. The second thing to note is, surely they're not just going to make it in that one line that you say they're going to make it. They're going to have 3 or 4 layers of analysis, and your random, this weird way of summarizing that argument is never going to give it enough credit. And ultimately, that preemptive time that you spend in your speech for that 2 minutes or 1 minute that you spend always becomes redundant at the end of the debate, because it's never made in such a shallow way. The arguments usually have more merit, and you're not engaging the full merit of it. So as a personal philosophy, again, not necessarily something that is written in hard and fast rule, I personally believe preemptives should never be done in that way, right? And my philosophy for preemptives are, try not to preempt opposition arguments independently with independent rebuttals. Use your arguments as preemptives, right? And the way this works is, instead of trying to think of opposition arguments and rebutting them, you know that opposition is going to rebut your arguments as well, or have arguments that are directly engaging your arguments. So it's more important to make your own arguments robust and, shielded from that attack that is inevitably going to come from the opposition, rather than just thinking about what the arguments opposition are going to make and thinking of independent rebuttals randomly to them, right? And in order to do that, I think there are 2 things that are very useful. The first is, try to phrase arguments probabilistically with multiple possibilities, right? So always say things like, to what extent is this likely to happen, right? It is very likely that X, Y, Z will happen, instead of saying X, Y, Z will happen, right? Saying things like, while it is true that, A could happen, it is unlikely that A will happen instead of B because, and then giving reasons for that, right? So it shows that you're cognizant of the fact that other things could happen, but you're giving reasons why yours is more likely to be believed, right? And this is a thing that I think teams often miss, because they often become, at least in the way they phrase their arguments, absolutist, which is, because A happens, B will happen, and because B happens, of course C will happen, guys. And by the way, C has impact 1, impact 2, impact 3. You should really care about C. And then a good team just goes, but B might not happen because of reasons 1, 2, 3. And then the rest of what you said just, falls out. So it's important to phrase arguments probabilistically with cognizance of the fact that there are multiple possibilities. That's the first. The second is, I find it really useful as an ESL speaker to be a devil's advocate to myself in the middle of my speech, right? So what does this essentially mean? This essentially means, I don't know if you know the term devil's advocacy. I think it's traditionally taught in debating as a thing you should do in prep, where you're told, there should be a devil's advocate in prep where they continuously critique you during your argument construction. So say I'm making an argument, my teammate should be the devil's advocate by questioning me about the flaws of the argument, making sure that there are no, holes left. I find it's particularly useful to analyze argument as a devil's advocate, right? So what I do is I always ask myself questions that are missing from the previous, the previous part of the argument or the analysis that I've given, right? So say I'm making an argument about, I don't know. I'm making an argument about, say, the stuff about information, right? Like if we give dictators immunity, they'll give us information and why that information is useful, right? The first thing you can analyze is why there's a dearth of information right now and why the vast majority of criminals are not prosecuted. Reasons why, number 1, number 2, number 3, this is true. Okay, so of course, now you believe that we need information, but why is this information going to be useful? See, I'm being a devil's advocate. I will say this in my speech, which is, I will say, why is this information useful? And then 1, 2, 3. Okay, this information is useful, but why will this information be there and plentiful? Why do dictators have an incentive to give this information out? And then, reasons why that is true. And then at the end, say, so there is a lack of information. This information is useful, and we do get a lot of access to it. What I've successfully proven is therefore, and then lead to impacts of that information, right? So what we often forget is the subtle questions that you need to spell out in the middle of your speech to make it clear to a judge exactly what you're selling, and make sure that there are no holes in your argument that your opponents can, grab onto. So if you don't do this, maybe your opponents, especially because straw manning is a thing nowadays. I see a lot of debaters do it and win debates. Actually make sure that there's no question left unanswered, right? So try to phrase the entire argument preemptively. Yeah, that's my third thought. The fourth is, I think it's always useful to add an aggressive burden push at the end of arguments, right? So you'll notice a bunch of things that debaters do, and this is really useful in BP. Again, of course, there are people with different philosophies arguing about this in debate series posting, but I personally think, burden pushing is really useful. So what is burden pushing? I hope everyone has heard of it in some capacity before, but it's basically saying at the end of your argument, for this argument to be broken, opposition has to do A, B, C. And if they don't do A, B, C, this argument stands. In some cases, you can also go further and say, ABC cannot be proven because, and then add the rebuttals that you want to add, even in PM, right? And that's essentially saying, even if they make this argument, that argument cannot stand because of, and then that is essentially rebutting them. And then just saying, okay, and therefore this argument cannot be disproven, and therefore this argument is debate winning because, and then frame it, right? And framing is a different lecture altogether. I'm sure there are lots of good framing lectures online. I think Ayal has one. I think Jason has a really good framing lecture as well, if I remember correctly. But what I'm trying to suggest is that it should be something you remember in PM as well, that the kinds of burden pushing that whips do, and the kinds of things they say where, opposition would have had to do this, and, if they didn't do this, it's a failure on their part and they're losing the debate. You should start that in PM as well. The last thing, probably minor, but something useful to remember, is do take POIs at opportune moments, okay? I always find that the 1 to 1.5 minute mark is the best time to take POIs, because usually it's just a bunch of egotistic, overconfident opponents thinking they know a lot, thinking they're trying to trap you into asking something, but asking something really dumb instead, right? So it's usually a really dumb POI from the 1 to 1.5 minute mark. Take that POI, make fun of them, make it clear to the judge that your opponents are, absolute idiots, and move on with your speech. Later on, especially for ESL speakers, what happens is you have to recalibrate as you go forward, because unless you have a very good understanding of your capabilities, there'll always be times where you need to rush slightly or slow down slightly. And you wouldn't want a POI to interrupt that at a latter part of your speech. So it's very useful to take POIs early on. That's my philosophy. And that allows you room to engage as well and, be more of a whip. Because if the whip can see the whole debate, at least you get some exposure to what your opponents are going to say very early on. And then you can recalibrate your thinking accordingly, right? So that's basically the second part of this lecture. Any questions about these thoughts? I hope you guys could hear me. I'm not sure if my internet was smooth throughout.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, fantastic. Any questions? No? Everything makes sense?
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
But it's mostly about, so there are some times where a CO team just does not want to engage, it does not want to give a POI, and then they have this radical extension later on, and they don't want to take your POIs at OG. Do you have any tips to be dealing with, or even a CG team extending for you will have a radically new context and reframe? Do you have tips for dealing with?
Of course, to some extent, it sucks when that happens. Especially if the CO team is a really good team, and their extension makes a lot of sense. Not a lot you can do, but you can do a couple of things that make them seem like idiots before they speak. The first is you can make fun of them for being afraid to ask you a POI. Start it at PM, where you say things like, I'd really appreciate one from CO, or, really expecting a POI from CO, or something stress on it. And then from DPM, just make fun of them if they don't ask the POI. Just say things like, CO must be really afraid to engage, or, CO surely has something really nonsensical, because if they had any relevance, they'd ask us. Okay, maybe the second thing is a bit too far, but just make it really abundantly clear to the judge that you want to engage CO and they're not doing it. That's the first. The second is, of course, it's not as possible in the online era, but if CO are speaking and they do not take a POI from you, make faces about that as well, or ask a POI with one from opening, something like that, right? I know that, again, in my opinion, if you're CO and you're not taking any POIs from OG, you deserve the heckle, right? You should take at least one, in all fairness, unless the OG team are doing really bad and are absolutely irrelevant to the debate, and the CG team are very clearly winning. As CO, you should, and if they don't, make fun of them. Can you guys hear me? Did you hear the both things I said? I'm not sure if you did. Sorry guys, developing world, poor internet. Sorry, I forgot who asked the question, but is it clear?
Yeah, very, very helpful.
Cool. Yeah, I guess that's it. I don't know if there are any other strategies. The other thing is if it is a really rad extension, of course, there's only so much you can do in a 15-second POI. So the strategy I always used was, I would always attack the argument's premise. okay? Never attack an example, never attack analysis. You will never be able to disprove all the analysis of an argument. Try to point out a flaw in the assumption of the extension, because the assumption is where the whole foundation stands. And try to disprove it with some analysis that you've already made in OG, right? And I think that's the most useful way to break a case that's really rad, really different, where you say, okay, your entire extension is premised on the fact or assumes the fact XYZ, and then say, this fact cannot stand when we've already explained to you number one, number two, number three, or something like that, right? And then make them have that foundation be built stronger. If they do it, well, hats off, accept a second. If not, that's still a good enough shot of winning the debate, because it's at least made very clear to a judge that this is a very critical flaw without which everything they're saying, which is really rad, really new, a bunch of new things, cannot stand, right? So that's the third thing I'd suggest as strategy to deal with a rad CO, yeah? Cool, okay. If there aren't any more questions, the third thing I'd suggest is some strategic adjustments to the purpose of PM speeches, especially if you're ESL. Okay, this is, again, for me, I'm an ESL speaker. I do not know how to say a lot of things very quickly. Okay, maybe I do say a lot of things very quickly, but I end up shouting or not sounding very nice. And of course, like, whenever I see some of the best PMs in the world, one of my biggest fears is I can never be as eloquent as them or deliver the kind of material they're delivering in the same frames and the same powerful connotations within the same specified amount of time, right? So I realized that with time, I need to be cognizant of my limitations and categorize my PM speeches and my approach to PM speeches based on some factors that come into play, right? So these are thoughts that I thought of, like, again, it's a continuous process. The first time I went to Worlds in Mexico, I discovered some of it. Then again, in Asians or, in subsequent Worlds as well. It was all a bit of trial and error until I've tried to, until I've, to some extent, been conscious of these categories. So I've tried to list them down. Yeah, so of course, there may be other things, but it's just my thoughts of what I think the categories of PM speeches should be, okay? So for me, there are 4 ways in which you can recalibrate your PM speech. Of course, if you are super eloquent, super EPL, super white, excuse the lack of political correctness, you don't need to think of this as consciously. But for speakers that come from ESL or EFL backgrounds, I think this is useful. So the categories are, the first is a matter dump, okay? Philosophically speaking, in my head, okay, none of these are like dictionary words. A matter dump is basically a PM speech where you blurt out a bunch of arguments, trying to just make sure you overburden your opponent with things to deal with. Like at the end of your PM speech, there will be 4 or 5 arguments standing. They may miss certain links. They may miss certain layers of analysis, but you will say so many things that your opponents just become overloaded, okay? And then of course, your subsequent speakers can add to the analysis and reframe and, make whatever is important necessary, whatever is necessary important, my bad. The second is a characterization heavy speech, which is you don't make as many arguments, okay? You make maybe 1 argument or 2 arguments, but you spend a lot of time on making sure that the problem is crystal clear, explaining incentives, explaining psychology of specific actors, spending a good 4 to 5 minutes building that 1 argument, making it super emotional, making the judges care about it, right? So that's a characterization or like a illustration heavy speech, PM speech. The third is a setup heavy PM speech, which is before even thinking about the problem and thinking about how specific arguments benefit the problem, you recalibrate the debate to a specific context that you're going to win. Okay, I don't know if context is the right word, but it's basically, adding like a 5 or 6 layer model and saying that here's what the debate is about. It is not about this. It is not about that. It's not about that. Taking the debate away from developed countries, making it all about the developing countries, if in some cases, giving reasons why that is the only thing that matters in debate. Like basically making sure the debate goes to one specific area and just saying that, okay, and then here's one argument to win that area, right? The fourth is, of course, a bit of everything. As an ESL speaker, I've tried a bit of everything a lot of times and failed miserably. What ends up happening is when you try to do all of these things where you're matter dumping, you're characterizing, and you're also trying to set up a debate, you just struggle, right? Because you have language limitations. And what ends up happening is it's a really boring speech with a lot of shouting in my case, and not necessarily the most pleasant speaker points either. But if it works out, I've been lucky enough to see some of the best speeches where all of this has happened. It could be some of the best speeches in the world. So of course, there's a high risk, high reward ratio there, but it's about understanding when to do what. So how exactly should you understand which approach to take as an ESL speaker? The first is obviously the motion, right? Like in specific cases, specific types of motions will require specific roles. We'll get into that in a bit. The second is your strengths, your weaknesses, and your preferences. It's important to self-evaluate or appraise yourself on what you're good at, right? So within a few years of debating, I always knew what my strengths were, right? And I always knew what my limitations were. Even now, like I'm sort of rusty. I don't think I'm in my prime anymore, but I can very clearly tell you these are my limitations. These are the kinds of motions that I will struggle with. These are the kinds of arguments that I won't be comfortable making, or these are the kinds of speeches that I will not be able to deliver at my best, right? It's important to know what you're good at and know the limits of your abilities. The second thing is it's also important to know your DPM strengths and weaknesses, in the sense that your PM speech is only as good as the person right after you and what he does with what you've done, right? And if you're really good at something, but he's absolute terrible at complementing that, your team is going to be a disaster, right? So I just think it's important to always talk to your teammates. It's unfortunate if you don't have a fixed teammate, but it's really useful to debate with the same person over a period of time, because you get to understand each other's strengths and weaknesses far more strongly. So how exactly does all of this work? So when you want to matter dump, you should think about whether the motion has multiple winning arguments, right? Don't make arguments for the sake of arguments. Oh, by the way, how you do this, there's a lecture on case prepping or motion prepping by Ashish Kumar on YouTube, which is another lecture that I saw and I thought was quite useful, where he describes type A and type B motions, or type 1 and type 2, I forgot. One type of motion is motions that have one winning argument. The other is motions that have multiple winning arguments. So I won't go into detail for how you identify that. You can just look at that lecture. It's a 40 to 50 minute lecture. It's very useful. But if the motion has multiple winning arguments, it's important to dump all of them from PM, because you need to first pressurize your CG into not having much material left. Number two, you need to eat up material to identify where exactly your OO wants to take the debate. And your second speaker can, of course, navigate the most important parts and use the unengaged parts to frame and win the debate, right? So that's the first. The second is you need to be an efficient and eloquent speaker, right? Of course, if you're someone that's slow, if you're someone that likes storytelling and building up instead of going like, 4 layers under this, layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, matter dumping is going to be slightly more difficult for you. So try to calibrate yourself and understand whether you can be a matter dumping PM. Some people just can't, some people can. The third is your DPM is a very frame or characterization oriented speaker when engaging, rather than a direct engager, right? So I can give you my personal experience. When I used to debate with Shoradip, who was my previous long-term teammate, inevitably what we ended up doing was, especially in OG, always matter dumping, because he was far more comfortable framing stuff, storytelling, making specific parts of a case important. but he wasn't particularly good at building up arguments from scratch as much as he was at outframing opponents or saying they're not fulfilling their burdens very well, which is why he was an excellent whip, but wasn't as strong in DPM in terms of the, positive contribution stuff. So what we realized was very quickly that our strengths and weaknesses complemented each other best when I dumped everything and left it. And he could specifically decide which ones the opponents were not engaging very well and use that to win debates, right? And a really good example of this is the WUDC 2010 Open Semis. There was an OG case where Sheng Wu goes first, and he dumps, I think, like 4 winning arguments with a bunch of analysis. And JLM just continuously frames that and says why each of those things wins the debate independently. And also points out how there's another area in the debate and, has some level of positive contribution as well, but far more focused on framing Sheng Wu stuff and making sure that it's pointed out with humor why OO is failing to engage. So that's matter done. When I think you need to use heavy characterization is when one motion has few winning arguments. So it requires a lot of depth and it requires a lot of sellability, right? So if it's just one argument, you can't just make it and say, okay, the argument number 1, 3 layers. Layer number 1, layer number 2, layer number 3, impact, okay, done, right? What do you do for the rest of your speech? The other thing is, since you're hedging like your entire case on that argument, if you fail, you're done, right? Like if your opponents engage it, you're done. So it's important to build up the necessary like the necessary characterization that supports that argument so that it is bulletproof and it is something that cannot be engaged to as strongly, right? The second is, of course, your efficiency is limited, but your storytelling is strong, right? So I know a lot of speakers that can do the layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, but can sell a lot of good things as a story, right? So for that, I think a characterization heavy PM speech is far more useful. The third is your DPM is a very engaging layered speaker. So even though you said it as a story, what they'll do is, say things that, opposition failed their burden in 2 ways. Number 1, number 2. For those reasons, we have, we're winning this debate because this proves number 1, number 2, number 3, and they're dumping a bunch of stuff as engagement and defending you with those layers, right? So that's where I think it's important to think about how you construct your case. So the WUDC 2010 quarters that I was referring to was an example of this, where the DPM, I think, I forgot if it was the Auckland team, I think. Oh, it wasn't Auckland, was it? It was actually a Sydney team or a Monash team. My bad. It was an Oceania team. I can't remember which team. But from my memory, if my memory serves me correctly, the DPM went up and did exactly this, where a lot of the storytelling that was there in PM only got concretized or crystallized when the DPM just pointed out the useful things that the PM has said and used that as layered engagement, right? So that's another approach that you can take as well. The third is when to use heavy setup. The first is when you think you just have no clue how to defend one side of the motion, right? It's super unintuitive for government and has some really obvious opposition lines of attack. And for that reason, you really know that if any of those lines of attack stand, you are done, right? There's maybe a niche gov case, but a bunch of really obvious things that if Ob just defends and repeats enough times, there's no way you're, winning the debate to an average judge who'll just be sold on the rhetoric of those obvious things. So you need to get rid of them and you need to do it very quickly, right? So that's when the setup, like this debate applies here. Here's the model that we're using. All that stuff becomes more useful. The second is, of course, where there's only a few arguments and those arguments are the only arguments that you can use to win. So in order for that argument to matter, you need to make sure it is shielded from a bunch of opposition attacks. And it's not just the characterization attacks, it's a bunch of fiat attacks that you need to make sure they don't take advantage of. So you model it out, make sure that, your case is stopped, it's shielded from those kinds of attacks. As for the bit of it all, general philosophy don't. It doesn't work out. But sometimes we're not smart debaters, right? Like you're just not sure what kind of motion this is. It's one of the motions from Thailand Worlds. Sorry, guys. Sorry, Jess, if you're watching this. Terrible motions that I don't hide it. But if you're confused, like why is a World's edge core setting such a ridiculous motion? Just do everything, right? Like you don't know what's going to work. You don't know who these opponents are. There's a bunch of random judges that you've never met in your life and you don't know what they like, right? Like just do a bit of everything. Pray to dear God that one of them works out, right? That's first. The second is like, you're really in the zone, right? Like you're at the peak of your powers. You feel like, you can, you're like a PM god ready to rock the stage, right? You think you've mastered the art of PMing. It's a Worlds out round. You're in the octo finals of Worlds or quarterfinals of Worlds. There's a bunch of people supporting you. Just go for it. Yeah, maybe. But general advice, don't. So if you want to see a really good speech, it's WUDC 2015 round 3. I think is an example I use of. It's a PM speech by Ashish Kumar. This is the motion. If you guys, it's on YouTube. It's Malaysia Worlds. You'll notice that there's lots of characterization in that speech. There's heavy setup. I think there's like a 3 or 4 layered model, or maybe 5 layered. There's also like 5 arguments or 4 arguments that he runs with like 1 million layers, right? Like it's a very, very good PM speech, right? Maybe not even one of his best, but for me at the time, it seemed really good, even now, right? So what you will see in that speech is the things or the elements that I've talked about in the different categories of PM speeches, all of that coming into fruition in one speech. And you can watch it on YouTube. It's on YouTube. I won't bother you right now. I'll send the reference links over when we upload this. But if you search it on YouTube, you'll find it. Yeah. So that's basically it for this lecture. These are my random thoughts that I've constructed about PMing. I don't know if all of it made sense, but it made sense to me in my head when I debated. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer now. But that's basically it from my end in terms of the things I wanted to share. Can you guys still hear me? I get really stressed. Guys, can you hear me? Okay, awesome. Any questions, guys?
Hi, I have a question.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, basically at times what I see is that if I am proposition, my opposition might, or the opposition team might debate at their absolute best case or at my absolute worst case. I mean, they're being very uncharitable. Like, so what do we do then? Let's say that we can't, we might face a lot of problems introducing our arguments because they're very uncharitable. Like, how do we engage them?
Okay. From my understanding of the question, it's basically that if you make a case that you think is fair, but your opposition is not being fair to the analysis that exists and is cherry picking examples, straw manning it and making it sound worse than it actually is in its truest extent, what exactly do you do in that case, right? The most obvious answers are, the first thing is make sure your subsequent speakers point out what the actual thing you said in your speech was, and point out specifically why opposition's response is insufficient. Say, maybe literally explain the layers of analysis or remind the judge of them. The second thing is you can also flip it, and you can also say that what opposition is doing is hiding a lack of analysis with like an overblown rhetoric, right? And just literally say that, opposition wants to draw the conclusion X, but in order to draw the conclusion X, they needed to prove A. Have they proven it? No. If they don't prove it, maybe B could happen, but what are the reasons they've given for you to believe that B could happen? And then point out those reasons, rebut them, or say that they're insufficient, right? So flip it, use it and say that they're just resorting to this strategy because they don't have actual analysis and they're using it as a way of hiding the fact that they don't have analysis, right? Of course, if all of this doesn't work, just continuously remind the judge of exactly what has been said in the debate and pray to dear God they're listening, of course. Sometimes it doesn't work out. Yeah, but you just have to keep trying.
Thank you.
Yeah, so first question, if OO doesn't bother much about the setup I built to protect my two arguments, especially when there are relevant cases outside the setup where they try to attack, what can be the duties of DPM? So from my understanding of the question, it is that there are ways to attack your case even if they accept the setup, and what you do about that. Okay, first, this is a good place to be intuitively, because that means they're not taking a bunch of strategies that you have stopped for them. The second is, as the DPM, the duties are traditional. Point out to a judge why. If there are things within your case or your setup that still make your argument stand, why, in spite of everything that has been said by OO, those things are debate winning anyway. The second is, of course, rebutting whatever OO has said, and whatever and proving why what they're saying is insufficient or not true or not believable. But that's basically it. One of those two things. Okay. The next question, what would you recommend when facing teams that are also deliberately building their speeches around one of the strategies you mentioned? Like, how do you not crumple when the previous speaker is spamming crap tons of matter and arguments and you expect the second speaker to frame the debate around whatever wasn't responded to? Okay, this is a good question. I get this a lot. You will see teams that will do this. I think it's important to first tell yourself it's not the end of the world. You can deal with it. I think then it's an important trade-off that you need to make between framing out and responses. Yeah. So it's an important calculus that you need to make in your head, where you ask yourself, within the matter that is being dumped, which do I think deserves the greatest amount of response? Usually, it is the arguments that a PM is making first. Because what inevitably happens is any good PM will make the arguments they think are most important first, and will move on to slightly less important arguments later, even though those important arguments could, win the debate. So things they spend less time on, or things you think are slightly less important, outframe them. Say, okay, this argument is not relevant to this debate because number one, number two, right? And just say, okay, they will not win with that, and move it out. Then take the parts of their case that they have said are the most, well, maybe they haven't said are the most important, but you think intuitively are the most important because they haven't been framed out yet. There are three things you do. The first, you give a reminder to the judge of exactly what was actually proven, right, within that argument. Remind the judge, okay, this has missing analysis here. This has missing analysis here. What is actually proven is XYZ. Then number two, you rebut those things, right? And of course, give lots of responses, if possible, to the most important parts of their case. Then number three, even after the responses are done, say, even if this argument stands, and then try to outframe that as well, right? So of course, you can't deal with everything in your speech. So in order to optimize time, what you do is you outframe the slightly less important stuff. If they try to make it important later, you have, ladder speakers, DLO and op-whip to deal with that. The more important stuff in their speech, first, remind the judge of exactly what is proven. Second, respond in greater detail. Third, outframe if possible. Yeah. So it's about optimizing time. That's what I think is what you should continuously ask yourself. How much time do I have left in order to do what I want to, which is break their case, right? Yeah. How do we tackle fleshed out models from op? Probably don't. Unless the model is super unfair, try to point out why the model would be unfair or unlikely to be possible or would not lead to good outcomes. But usually if a team is being fair about the model, I would say don't engage it. Just say, despite the model, some arguments still apply, right? I've never really seen a case of a good model being engaged to and dealt with well, right? My suggestion is avoid it. How do you PM a speech where you have no clue about the motion? I don't know, man. How do you do any speech in a motion you have no clue about? I don't know. So like, I think this is a funny topic going around nowadays, like where a bunch of lectures that I've seen on YouTube are, how do you prep a case for a motion you know nothing about? Like my suggestion is learn, read. I don't think any other suggestion is a useful suggestion, right? Like, I don't know. Of course, you can make general guesses, I guess. Like if it's about, say you know nothing about Indonesia, you can make general guesses like, okay, what do I know about Indonesia? Indonesia is a Muslim country. It is a country in Southeast Asia. Okay, great. What do other Muslim countries look like? What do Southeast Asian countries look like? Oh, okay. So it's part of ASEAN. What happens elsewhere in ASEAN? Okay. And then like make reasonable guesses about that. Yeah. I guess that's it. Like that's how we tend to generalize Western societies, right? Like England, Germany, US, they're all very different. In debates, we tend to homogenize them and say, the West and its incentives to, do XYZ things, right? So try to homogenize in that way, I guess. But like my suggestion is read. I don't have a better suggestion than that. Yeah. Any other last minute questions? Anything else? No. I'll be around for another minute. If we have any further questions, we can discuss. Otherwise, we'll cut it short. Yeah, I guess they can. A bunch of them. Like, for me, at least, I'm not much of a sucker for debate rules. I'm very anti-boomer in this regard. I think teams that debate well should win. And the 2 times I coached WSDC, like I made it an explicit point where I just wanted them to debate well and make good arguments. So yeah, I think ultimately debating is an activity of persuasion. And if you can persuade people, well, they will give you the ballot. And I think humans tend to be similar in all kinds of debating. And of course, you can persuade them in the same ways that you can do in BP as well. But of course, some strategies like, how to outbox closing and, those kinds of things are less relevant. But a lot of things are, of course, relevant. How do you get into WSDC? I'm not sure. It depends on your country's circuit. Each country has its own selection process. For Bangladesh, of course, the circuit I'm regularly involved in, you have to participate in a national scale tournament, and there are multiple stages of selection through national camp. I'm not sure which country you're in, but whichever country you're in has its own selection process. So please look into that. Okay, I guess there aren't any more questions.
Yeah, I had a question, last question.
Yeah, go for it.
In the PM speech, what should I do most regarding comparatives and weighing? Like, which one should I do most in terms of arguing and setting up the debate?
Both. I don't think one is more important than the other. You need both to win a debate. Don't avoid doing either. Do both.
But as a in the PM speech, you don't have any other previous speaker. You're the very first speaker. So yeah, how do you weigh?
That was the second part of this lecture, right? Like you can frame stuff and treat it like a whip speech, right? Do the whippy things from PM, right? That's the second part of this lecture that we talked about. Do those things from PM, right? The kinds of things you traditionally think of. Think of what your opponents will ask and preempt your arguments against it. Right?
Yeah, it was helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks, guys. Hope it was useful. See you around.